My name is Joe Natoli. I am here to talk to you essentially about user experience. But we are also going to cross over a little bit into user interface design. All right? The topic here is called Think First. Why great UX starts between your ears and not on the screen. Okay? The idea being that when everybody, not everybody, but when most people think about user experience, their first thoughts are, it's about what happens on the screen, okay? Which is true. That's where it manifests itself. That's the part that people interact with. But for those of us here, those of you here who are developers, that is often seen as a challenge, right? I'm not a designer. I'm not a UI guy. That's not my strength. What I'm essentially here to tell you is that it doesn't matter, okay? You can create great user experiences. You can create very solid user interfaces without a shred of visual talent. And that's what we're going to talk about. A little bit about me to get this out of the way, so you aren't asking yourself, who the heck is this guy and why do I care what he has to say? I've spent the last 26 years helping organizations improve user and customer experience. Most of those organizations are Fortune 100, Fortune 500, and government organizations. I've also done, a lot of work with startups as well. The majority of that work is enterprise applications, okay? Most of my stuff is definitely B2B, financial services, healthcare, but I've certainly, done time in the consumer realm as well. I had my own firm for about 10 years. I sold it in 2007 to an IT firm. Hung out there for a couple of years to help them establish a UX practice, and got really restless. So I went back to doing what I love most, which is consulting. The things that I know, the things I'm going to share with you, okay, come from experience. And I want you to understand that experience doesn't necessarily equal success. Okay? Experience with failure is probably the greatest teacher you will ever have. It's the greatest teacher I've ever had. I've been part of projects that have succeeded, and I've been part of projects that have failed spectacularly. And I've learned some very important, albeit very hard, lessons from those things, okay? My entire philosophy is, if you've heard the expression, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. That's my philosophy behind what I do. I think that everybody in a team, an organization, is responsible for great user experience, okay? It's everybody's business. So therefore, everyone needs to understand some piece of how to do this and how it applies to what they do all day, okay? I have a book coming up, which I'm not going to bore you with the details, but, shameless self-promotion here. I got the audience. I have to tell you about it, right? It's called Think First, and it's based on this premise, essentially, okay? Again, I'm not going to bore you with all this, but we talk about user research, what questions you ask stakeholders, to the 3 critical questions you have to ask every client, every time, a better way to get meaningful UX requirements, which is the full-day workshop that I'm doing on Friday, okay? How to avoid scope creep, how to eliminate last-minute requests and surprises, okay, from clients, colleagues. So I have a special discount for all DevWeek attendees. If you see me after the session and give me a business card, you'll get it for a very significant discount, 30%, okay? That's that. The premise is this. One of the unfortunate things about the term user experience is the fact that the word user is in the title. User experience is about more than that. It's, to my way of thinking, it's a value loop, okay? On one side of the equation, you have users who want things that make their lives easier, right? They want to feel confident. They want to feel competent. They want to feel in control. On the other side of the equation, you have the business, right? Somebody's paying for all this. They have goals, all right? They have things that they're trying to accomplish. And at the end of the day, for most businesses, that means one of 2 things. It either means making money or saving it. Where user experience excels, where good design excels, where sound development practices and powerful technology excels, is in the middle, okay, where things serve both of those needs, both of those masters. To me, if you're not addressing either side of this equation, if you're missing the boat on one side, you're going to wind up with a problem. Here's what I know to be true. You absolutely do not have to be a visual artist in order to create useful, valuable, powerful user experiences, okay? It's not necessary. You do, however, have to be a problem solver of the absolute highest order. That's what design is. It's problem solving. It's not decoration, it's not aesthetics. It's problem solving. That means that in essence, you do have to be a designer, which in my mind, how many developers do we have here? All of you. All right? In my opinion, you are closer to designers than you may think. Okay? Developers excel at solving complex problems, at making the complex simple. Designers do the same thing, the good ones. All right? So my point is this. Your ability between your ears to do what you do is what allows you to be great. It's how you think about what you do as opposed to what you do tactically. Okay? That's the premise. Finally, I want to tell you this. Implementing the right solutions poorly, okay, which means you have great UX but poor UI design, is infinitely better than implementing the wrong solutions well, which means, hey, the UI looks great, right? It's beautiful. Everybody loves it. Wow, that's so cool. It looks fantastic. You know, and people will tell you, oh, I'd love to use that. If the UX is bad, the product fails, no matter how good it looks. You can get by with poor UI design if the user experience is spectacular, if it's easy to use, if it's easy to predict the outcomes of your action, if it follows some of the things we're going to talk about today. Okay? Keep that in mind. How many of you start your design process when you have to deal with a UI? I'm assuming some of you are tasked with designing UIs, right? How many of you start by looking at themes, Bootstrap, things like that? Nobody. A couple guys. Okay. That's a good thing, actually, because first place to look is not themes. Themes look very nice. Google right now, you know, UI themes or UI patterns or anything, and you'll see any number of very nice-looking things. The problem is those collections don't tell you anything about what problems they were created to solve. Okay? You have no idea how the design decisions were made to implement those examples. You're essentially just looking at something that's visual, but you don't have any sense of whether it's appropriate. Okay? Context is everything when it comes to interaction. For those of you who do design, how many of you start by looking at the work of other designers, other UIs? You can raise your hands big, it's okay. All right? Don't do that either. Okay? Don't look for inspiration. For pretty much the same reason. You will not find inspiration looking at the work of other designers, other UI designers. And the reason for that, and I want you to think about it for a second, the reason for that is that you won't find inspiration. What you will find is you'll find someone else's solution to someone else's problem. All right? They're solving a very different problem than you are. The problem that you have to solve belongs to you. It belongs to your clients. It belongs to the context in which people use what you're building. Context. So this is one of my favorite quotes when it comes to design of any kind, okay? Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought. All right? You're after the same thing in that you want to make it easy for people to use, right, what you're building. You want it to succeed. If it's your own app or your own system, you want it to make money. Or you just want people to share it and download it and love it, whatever it is. But the intent, okay, and the perceived outcome is infinitely more important. Anybody keep abreast of what's going, current UI trends? Anybody feeling the need to migrate to flat design? A couple people, okay? Don't do that either. Flat design is very much a widespread trend right now, okay? It's everywhere. Not to mention that the term drives me crazy, okay, because this is not new. However, what I'm seeing a lot of is that designers are adopting the look without considering whether it's appropriate or not. Okay, the workshop I was at this morning, Tobias's workshop, talked a little bit about this. When all the chrome goes away, when all the controls go away, when suddenly all we have is a little, the hamburger menu up there, all the visual cues that people depend on to find their way are gone, are missing, okay? The visual affordances that make it easy for people to understand how something is used are missing. In this rush to get rid of Chrome, in the rush to get rid of all this extraneous stuff, we're not giving people enough information, okay? I've seen sites and applications designed for desktop use where the menus are gone. And they're using, the hamburger menu, and it's all big and sparse, okay? People need to get stuff done. They don't need to spend time looking for something, all right, particularly in B2B situations, all right? Microsoft learned this lesson the hard way, okay? Don't be different just to be different. Differences can certainly draw attention, right? Being unique is celebrated, but they can also cause distraction. When someone has to spend time figuring out how to use your app, or if they're fixated on why the heck did they do this way, and if you've ever watched anybody in a usability lab, for those of you who may have had that experience, you see some amazing things. When people are fixating on something, they're focused on the wrong things, okay? And they can't complete the task that they were there for in the first place. So what's visually appropriate in one context may be completely inappropriate in another. There's that word again. Context. So again, it's about thinking. So you have to think about design in the true sense of the word, okay? Design is not pretty. That's not its job. Visual attractiveness certainly has value, but it's only one small component of what makes great user experience. So if we start by focusing on what's on screen, we're skipping the most valuable parts of the process. I hear this term a lot, look and feel. I hate it. What does it mean? Like, how do you feel a UI design? Does anybody know how? Anybody have the answer to that? No, me neither. All right, it's not about decoration. It's smart decision making. It supports established objectives, why we're doing this in the first place, right? What people expect to accomplish with it, what we expect to accomplish with it. It clarifies the available options. Here's what you can do here. It provides context, and it provides guidance. It establishes clear information priority and action priority. Do this first, do this next, do this after that. Here's where things are, okay? Good UI design essentially has three jobs. Notice that we're shifting from UX to UI. It has to do the following things exceptionally well. And I want you to notice we're not talking about visuals here. It has to organize. It has to provide the person with a very clear, consistent conceptual structure of how this thing works. Here's how I move through it. Here's how I interact with it. It has to economize, which means doing the most with the least amount of cues. Now, I made fun of flat design, but the principle behind it is sound, which means that everything that's not critical probably shouldn't be there. It also has to communicate, matching the presentation to the expectations and capabilities of the person using it. We're going to talk about all three of these things. You're also going to see these from time to time. They're takeaways. They're things I want you to remember. View everything that you do as problem solving, okay? Everything. Every action, every decision that you make, you're solving a problem. You are, in some way, intentionally or unintentionally, organizing, economizing, and communicating. Whether you do so poorly or do so well is a matter of how much attention you pay to it. So let's talk about organizing. A little organization goes a very long way. This is a UI of a screen a system I was asked to take a look at several years ago. Now, there's very poor visual hierarchy here. Okay? Everything is pretty much as visually important as everything else. You don't know what to look at first. There's no clear grid structure, okay? There's random proximity and alignment all over the place. There are categories and subcategories here, but they're not very clearly delineated or demarcated. Every one of these elements that you're looking at has equal visual weight, equal importance. Now, could we make this better visually? Of course. Do we need to? Not necessarily. Here's a different version, same thing. The visual design did not change one iota. Colors didn't change, typefaces didn't change, buttons didn't change. There's no difference in styling here. What is different are two things. Anybody? Any guesses? No? No volunteers? Change two things. Alignment and proximity. There's padding now in all these areas, okay? To separate chunks of information, to separate controls from content, okay? Title is now separate. Your core controls in the right corner, your basic, log in and log out functions, home screen, separated. Your top filters are now more clearly separated because there's more space around them and they're grouped more tightly together. Okay? The search function, it's ugly. It's not a search field, which is what people would expect, but at least it's clear and separated and it's not in anybody's way. Controls, navigation. And then down here at the bottom, we've got all this nested information. So by simply realigning things and separating things visually, you've now got chunks of information that the person can focus on, okay? Even though it's still a tremendous amount of information, it's definitely too much. But the volume was not a battle we were going to win, okay? Nor did we have the time and budget to redesign it. So the question was, what can we do? Two things, alignment, proximity. So in many cases, if you do nothing but reorganize something, you gain a lot. There are 4 key organizing principles, and they are alignment, proximity, repetition, and contrast. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one. The thing I want you to understand is that these principles are interconnected. Okay? You will almost never apply just one. Never. And I will also tell you that 9 times out of 10, when something isn't working, right, when customers are having a problem with the UI, if the numbers are bad, if the sales aren't what they should be, 9 times out of 10, it is because one of these 4 things is either completely missing or it's been misapplied. Okay? We're still not talking about visual design. Here's alignment for a second. That section of text that you're looking at right there is pretty easy to read, right? The reason it's easy to read is because your eye tracks to the same point at the end of every line, consistently, like this. Once that's established, and if that point remains consistent, we can move really fast. This, by comparison, is a bit of a different story. It's a lot harder. Why? Take a look where the tracking points are. Your eye has to find the beginning of the next line, your eye and your brain, okay, together. That's cognitive work. And in a couple paragraphs, you may think, well, it's no big deal. In an enterprise application that has hundreds of screens, forms, it's exhausting. Okay? People often get fatigued without even knowing it. They get frustrated, they get angry, and they can't necessarily tell you why. But the reason is they're having to do too much work up here. That's the power of alignment. Here's an example in a layout. This is another case where the company wanted to, tell everybody everything that they do in one screen. Sometimes you can talk them out of that, sometimes you can't. When you can't, you have to rely very heavily on alignment. What I want you to notice here, and I realize it's probably hard to see from where you are, essentially everything on this screen is visually aligned with something else. Even the inconsequential things, okay? Like if you run across here, you can see that date up there aligns with the bottom of Learn More, runs across the bottom of this photograph. vertically. See the edge of the R in delivered? Lines up with the right edge of the C in contact, the H in highly, the O in R, the U in user needs, and it comes straight down. Now, do those things seem logically connected in your mind? No. But even the unconscious things, the unconscious relationships that happen from far left to far right, from top to bottom in a screen, create a sense of order. Okay? It's all very important. Alignment provides cognitive stability. All right? It creates visual relationships between things. It's how our brains make sense of what we see. All right? So essentially, every single element, and this is just Joe's rule, okay? Well, obviously, the rule of alignment has been around for a while, but to me, every element in a UI should have a visual relationship with another element, period, in some way. If it doesn't, to me, that means there is a problem with the underlying grid structure. There's a problem with visual hierarchy. So for my money, when in doubt, align everything, okay? Look for relationships, even when it seems there are none. That's the way you create order, it's the way you create flow, it's the way you create stability. Next principle, proximity. It essentially means that elements that are visually close to each other, okay, are perceived as a single group. They're perceived to work in concert with each other, okay? They're related by context of use. This section of elements over here, they're all very close to each other. All right, visual segregation aside, they read as one group, okay? These are jumping off points. These two arrows in the right corner, okay, read as one group. They're close together. And the fact that, you have a left and right arrow doesn't hurt. These three pieces of core content, they're close together, they're treated visually the same way, they're related. Unrelated items are visually separated, okay? They have more distance. This bar in the middle is essentially an ad, okay? It's a little promotion piece. It's pushing you off somewhere else. Notice how they're treating it. It's completely segregated in the center of the field. It's not too close to anything else. It stands on its own. This title discussion, what's interesting about this is it's actually too far from the content it goes with, okay? Because it belongs to these things down here. There's actually too much distance, top and bottom, of discussion. It really should be closer together. So the mind says that goes with this. Okay? Proximity is important. So you want to group related elements contextually, and they form a perceived whole. That's why you can quickly glance at that and get, okay, those are jumping off points to other articles. I get it. I know how this works. Here's an example of a form, okay? The reason the user experience of this form and the reason the usability testing was so poor for this form is not because it's ugly, which it is. It's because these items are essentially visually segregated. All those fields read as one group of information. The labels, rather. The fields read as another group, okay? Two different things. What should happen is I should see an automatic relationship between label, field, label, field, label, field, right? All this space between the two is separating them contextually, visually. It's cognitive work, okay? And the fact that the distance between the label and the field changes constantly is not helping. So if we redesign this, and increase the proximity between the label and the field, it's a lot easier. Okay? It's a lot faster for someone to work through that. If you put the labels on top of the fields, it's even faster because now, where over here, we're going left to right, left to right, left to right, left to right, in this case, we go straight down. Okay? Your eye doesn't have to move, your brain doesn't have to do any additional work. And again, this may sound silly to some of you, but multiply one activity times hundreds of times. And in enterprise apps in particular, this is most people's day-to-day reality. Errors, a large percentage of errors, come from fatigue. This is how you combat that. Okay, so In both cases, we moved the labels and the fields together. We clarified the relationship between the two things. I'll give you another example. This is just a basic layout. Another big part of proximity is negative space. Out of curiosity, have you ever heard someone refer to negative space as blank space on the screen, white space? Yeah. That's this. The space between elements goes a long way in delineating them and making sure that they read either as groups or as separate, unrelated pieces of information. So that space in between, which is the part that most people pay the least amount of attention to, is actually the most important. All right? Negative space enables focus. Negative space is absolutely not blank space, okay? It's purposeful. It's important. It's the space between margins. It's the space between graphics, the space between gutter, the space between sentences, the space between letters, all right? Between columns, between lines of type, visuals, et cetera, et cetera. I can't emphasize this enough, okay? Negative space is incredibly, incredibly important to good UI. So you want to purposefully design all negative space. And in fact, I would strongly suggest that you give it more attention than the actual UI elements themselves. Because how you deal with negative space will have a more profound impact on whether people can get through what you've built than just about any other thing that you do. Let's talk about repetition. The commonly understood, thought is that, well, okay, I'm going to develop a style for this and a style for this, and I'm just going to rubber stamp it across all my screens, right? It's not really about that. It's about picking up style elements, okay, and sort of reapplying them, reusing them in different ways. So if you look at this nav bar up here, okay, we've got obviously a strong background color, we've got a specific font, we've got a style. That's applied to this button down here, this Learn More button. Okay, they're picking up the color, they're picking up the font style. They're also applying it down here in these headlines. Now, is the font size different? Sure. Same color scheme, though. Same font, same background color. If you look at this headline, shopping cart development, they're picking up that same font down here in these subheads. If you look at the three circles up there, circle motif is repeated in the carousel. If you look at the background color of that main navigation bar, that appears again. If you look at the orange background color, which I should have highlighted better, it's over here. They're using that in the typography, in the labels. Okay, so you see what's happening? They're not taking the exact same style. But in this case, what you usually do is you create a hierarchy of visual style. You start with an element, right? It's the header. It's the main callout. It's whatever. Once you establish that, you reuse it. Reuse pieces of it, okay? Same elements and corresponding style, visual elements. That's what makes screen to screen to screen feel like it's all part of a cohesive whole. Design patterns are part of that, okay? If you're developing, for iOS, for Apple, and this is a bit dated, you leverage Apple's iOS design patterns. Why? Because people have an understanding of what those things are and how they work. If you're developing for Microsoft, it's the same deal. Okay? You leverage what people are familiar with. That repetition, that familiarity, creates ease of use. Android, no different. Okay, that's why these exist. And it's not about making things visually nice and visually similar. It promotes ease of use. All right? So established design patterns are things that people know and people expect. That purposeful repetition increases consistency in the experience. I don't have to keep figuring out how this works. I don't have to keep figuring out, where headlines are, where chunks of information are, because it's visually consistent all throughout every screen. I don't have to figure out where the button is, for my primary action. Let's talk about contrast. This is really easy to read. Stark, complementary colors, high contrast. This is also easy to read. even though it's white on black, okay? When text is the brightest element, where that's the maximum focus of contrast, readability is still good. Also, proximity, the padding, the negative space around that element, also makes it easier to read. However, when you get into situations like this, and I will tell you that I see this much more often than I would ever believe possible. When there's no contrast between text and a background, your eyes strain. They have to work very hard, okay? Even when colors are complementary, that does not mean that contrast is appropriate. In this case, you have two bright colors against each other, and they vibrate, okay? Super saturated colors, especially on a screen, you know, any kind of screen where there's refracted light coming back into your eyes, is very taxing. Okay, so you have to be really careful with color, because contrast is really what's driving whether it works or not. Let's say I'm designing an app and I'm using a dark gray background like this, okay? I start there. Where's your focus? Okay, I introduce a header element that's slightly lighter, right? It's on that lighter bar. Now I introduce a main content area. Where's your focus now? It's on the main content area. Why? Because it's the most contrast. If I add text up there that's a shade of the background color, I'm calling your attention to it. If I add text down here, everybody else loses because that's where the highest contrast is. You can't help but go there, whether you want to or not. So areas of highest contrast are what draw people's attention to what they see. So contrast has to be applied according to order of importance. This is a big one. When someone calls me, okay, I'm a consultant. When someone calls me, it's because they have a problem, right? So by the time I get in the room, something is not the way it's supposed to be. Contrast is one of the biggest culprits across everything that I do, all right? It's that visual attention is paid to the wrong things on the screen. People are going, well, I don't know what to press. I don't know how I'm supposed to get out of this screen. And the button's right there. It's visible, it's obvious, and we can all see it. But the contrast is somewhere else on the screen, and what's happening is that their eye is constantly being pulled away towards it. And it makes it hard for them to keep focusing on that button. Contrast is huge. Right? So primary content, primary actions deserve the most contrast. CNN does a great job with this. Okay, red, black, and white, you cannot possibly create higher contrast than those three colors. It's not possible. Plus, they're doing the red thing because it gives you a sense of urgency, right? Heightened emotion. Red is like, this is important. Danger, pay attention. So the contrast that they're using reinforces that reaction. It's urgent, okay? They want you to pay attention. Oh, I forgot to say that. My analogy with contrast and color is this. Think about it like starting a fight, okay? And it's kind of like this. If color starts something, contrast finishes it. That's how important contrast is. Important hierarchy, yeah, good. Information hierarchy is mainly created by contrast. All right, so you should always, 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 always consider contrast before color. We often, and the couple designers that I work with, when we do pull in UI people, we almost always start even finished UI design in grayscale, so we can be sure that the contrast is appropriate first. Any color that gets applied has to match that contrast. So we talked about economizing, that's the next piece. The mantra is this, all right? The usefulness of anything that's on screen essentially decreases when there's more of it, okay? Entertainment websites are really supremely guilty of this. They roll out these huge sites, there's a ton of content everywhere with the mistaken idea that people want all of it all at once. And the numbers go like this. And they go, why? People tell us they want this stuff. It's too much of it. Okay? They have to decode every single element that's on screen. The brain has to do work to make sense of that. So choices about what you include, how much you include, have to be based on people's cognitive abilities, okay? Their limitations. So what you're trying to do is minimize cognitive load. You want to only show the elements that are absolutely critical to communication. Whatever's included has to be immediately relevant to the task at hand. What am I doing right now? What do I expect to see? You want to visually emphasize those critical elements and actions, and you want to de-emphasize the ones that are not critical. Whatever's most important has to come forward, has to stand out. Take a look at this form. All right, it's pretty common. Form has a title, it has a bunch of radio buttons, it has an OK and cancel button. Here's the thing about this. There are a couple problems here cognitively. Number one, you notice that the alignment is kind of all over the place. All right? Number two, every one of these elements has to be perceived separately. Again, that's how the brain and the eyes work together. So, truly, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Come on, you can do it. 11, 12, 13, 14. Don't die on me. 15. Okay? There are 15 elements in that little tiny form. 15 things that have to be perceived and understood. As silly as it sounds, it's absolutely true. So if you redesign this form, you make it look like that, you simplify things greatly. Okay, remember what I said about being different? Don't be different just to be different. Be different when it's better. This is better. A couple reasons. Number one, my choices are all in alignment with each other. Number two, the title of the form is segregated from the actual action, the content. Number three, what's most important, right, to submit this, is called out. The cancel button is now just a little text link. Why? Because you didn't open the form to cancel it. That's not really what you're there for. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. A lot simpler. Doesn't really look pretty either. Okay? Doesn't matter. Economy is all about what people see. All right? And again, we're not talking about attractiveness or decoration. We're talking about economy. So if you have two primary actions, or two actions on a form, rather, you have to differentiate between the two. Most themes, Bootstrap, for example, gives you a default button set. And I see a lot of this. Okay, here's a save button, here's a cancel button. The problem is these two things are not of equal importance. This is much better. Why? Because the primary action is painfully obvious. Secondary action is minimized. Okay? This is most important. This is not. It is these tiny little details that create great user experiences. It is not the big, giant, amazing, breakthrough design principles. It's this stuff. When you have three actions, okay, primary, secondary, and a tertiary, you delineate the same way. Create stays blue because it has the most contrast, both in color and, if you were to turn this to grayscale, it would have the most contrast. So the Save Draft button, okay, is outlined. It's more important because it has a visual shape. Cancel is still cancel. Just a text link. Okay, that's hierarchy, that's order of importance. Primary, secondary, tertiary. That's about creating economy, all right? Maximize signal, minimize noise. Everyone's heard of the signal to noise ratio, right? You want to work to increase the ratio of relevant information so that it's more than the degree of irrelevant information. Noise reduces clarity. It dilutes useful information with useless information. It tells us stuff we don't care about when we're trying to focus on the things that we do care about. So you want to minimize noise, you want to remove unnecessary elements, and you want to minimize or simplify representations, okay, of necessary elements. So this is from an e-commerce website. This is Walmart. My question to you is this. Do you need to know all of this right now in order to take the very next action? Because nobody's going to buy a phone on the very first screen they see. Okay? Doesn't happen ever in the history of ever. Do you need to know all that? Or do you need to know this? When you look at research across a broad range of cellular products or digital products or smartphones, what you see is that there are three things that people care about. What's the operating system that it's running? Okay? How good is the camera? And, does it have Wi-Fi capability? How high is the Wi-Fi capability? Or, if not, whether it's on 4G or something like that. This is the stuff that people care about. These are the three things that will enable them to take the very next step. Okay, I'm interested. I want to learn more. Price is pretty good. It's got good ratings. It's got the three things that I think I was after. All right, I'll click the button. That's all you're gunning for, that very next action. Here's another example. This is a financial services application. This is for an insurance organization whose analysts are responsible for creating daily reports of activity. And they're all in different segments. So one person in a very specific department with a very specific set of information related to that company's products. This is what he saw every day. Now, so our question was, do you need all that information in order to do, 80% of your daily tasks? The answer was no. What he needed was this. Core summary, the ability to click into things if I wanted to see more, and the ability to get to that deeper information if he needed it. All that other stuff is noise. All right? It's minimizing that person's efficiency, their ability to do their job, because there's all this work that has to happen. All right? Simplify, simplify, simplify. Progressive disclosure is probably one of the, if not the king of the hill principle for great user experiences. It's definitely one of the most important, okay? Which means only the necessary information or requested information is shown at any given time. I either want it or I asked for it. Because if it's presented to me and I'm not interested in it and I'm not ready to process it, it's noise. That's why smartphones, work the way they do. They answer the crucial question, which is, what's required to take the very next step? If I want to check the weather, I can glance at my home screen, in this case, and I can see it. Here's where I am. It's sunny out right now. I don't even have to read. I know it's sunny. It's nice. If I do want more, then I tap and I get more. And there's usually another layer past this. But it's a perfect example, okay? You're only giving somebody what they want when they want it. So you're helping people manage complexity. You're making sure that they're not confused or frustrated or overwhelmed. Here's another example. The automatic, scrolling, automatic loading when you get to the bottom of the screen, same thing. UI design of every kind is a balancing act between completeness and simplicity. You say, well, we want to give people all this information, right? They need it. They want it. It's important. True. But too much of anything is just that. It's too much. All right? So you initially show what's important. In LinkedIn and Facebook, you see this, and you see it in websites as well, where stuff only loads when I get down to the bottom, which tells the machine, I want more. Okay? You have to prioritize what you do according to what people want and what businesses need. You offer a larger set of specialized options on request. Okay? The additional stuff is only shown when there's evidence that I want it, that I've asked for it. Okay? So we're dipping into interaction, in a way as well. If you've ever gone to the bank to withdraw money, it's pretty much the same process. 4 core things that I do when I go to the bank are right there. When I choose one, I get a second set of options, but it's very segregated. Okay? The focus is on what I'm doing right now. The more brain power someone has to use to decode your user interface, the less they have left over to understand it. Okay? If I have to do all this work to figure out what's in front of me, and if I have to do that work repeatedly, screen after screen after screen, I'm done, man. Now I got to make sense of what I see. In data visualization applications in particular, I could do an entire week on big data, all right? Data visualizations are powerful, no doubt. The promise of big data is valuable. But if no one can understand what they're seeing, or if they have to work like hell to make sense of it, there's no value there, okay? Context. You got to show what matters most first. You have to communicate that more is available, okay? If this isn't enough for you, there's more. There's a way to get it. You have to point the way to get to it all. So the takeaway is, the most critical principle of UX, in my mind, is progressive disclosure, all right? Just, you got to remember this. As a user, anything I didn't want or did not ask for is noise. It's an obstacle. It's a barrier. It's in my way. Finally, UX and UI have to work to communicate. Our expectations of things are first formed visually by what we see. Okay? We have an instant reaction to things that we see. I want to stress that that is not because we find them attractive or unattractive. That certainly matters. It's certainly an influencer. But when it comes to products, that's not the sole decision maker, all right? At a glance, when you see something, your brain is processing answers to possible questions. Okay, what is this? What does it do? How well does it do that? How hard is it going to be for me to use this? Okay, and what's it going to cost me in terms of time, in terms of effort, in terms of, trying to figure this out? This is the Nest thermometer. Anybody familiar with this? Seen it before? If you've ever had to use a traditional digital thermostat, you'll know why this exists. Because they're a pain. It's a little LED screen. You have to go through 10,000 prompts. There's only 3 buttons on the thing for 50 nested functions. Nest pays attention to how you set your temperature, and it acts that way for the rest of the week. All right? It learns from what you do. Everything about this says simplicity, easy. Forget about the fact that it's visually attractive, which it is. It communicates visually what it does, okay, and how easy it is. We absolutely judge books by their covers. Before you pick up a book, hey, where are we going? Before you pick up a book and decide to read it, you've already decided. Your brain has already told you what you think of it before you pick it up. I'm a golf geek, right? So before I take 3 steps and decide I want to swing that club, I want to know what it feels like, I've already decided I want to. Why? Because it has all that cool stuff on there. And again, it's not just visually the way that it looks. It's that in my mind, because as much as I desperately want to be a great golfer, it's never going to happen. All those little adjustments that I can make me think, oh, I can compensate for my deficiency. All right? Before you test drive a car, when you go into a store to try on clothes, when you decide to pick up that new tablet and play with it, before you click or tap anything on a website, your brain has already told you whether it's worth your while or not. You've made a snap judgment as to whether this is worth your time. The first experience someone has with something, digital products in particular, is absolutely the most critical. And here's why. It's kind of like a first date. All right? And there are 2 possible outcomes to this first date. Either the relationship continues, right? People keep using the product, which essentially means you get more dates, okay? Or your date runs for the exit and never calls you again. This obviously is not a good thing in life or in business, okay? People have to perceive value. They have to see a reason to engage in the relationship. From first glance, from first experience, from first, look at something. And then, once they're engaged, once they make the commitment to tap something, to click something, to swipe, whatever it is, they have to get continuous proof of that value. Yep, it's still worth your time. Yep, it's still worth your time. We promise, it's still worth your time. Okay? Has to be continual. The thing I want you to remember is that expectations are formed visually. Okay? Are we stuck? I want to go to the next slide. Okay, so your focus has to be on communicating value. Again, it's not what it looks like. It's not about visual attractiveness. When I say communicate, when I say visual expectation, does it communicate value? What I can do here, how easy it's going to be or how hard it's going to be, and what I'm going to get, right? A promise. Trust is absolutely earned with any type of digital product. Okay? Even if it's an in-house time and attendance application that people absolutely have to use because it's mandated, they still have to trust it, because otherwise they'll rush through it and they'll do a terrible job and the company doesn't get, the numbers that it needs. The very first visual exposure has to rapidly establish a value proposition. Here's why this matters. You have to lead them toward continuing the experience. Anybody here that believes that nothing should be more than 3 clicks or 3 taps away? If you do, please raise your hand. See, you're afraid to, the way I set that up. People will click 100 times if every click delivers value. If every click delivers proof that they're getting closer to their goal, okay, that they're getting value. The number of clicks is irrelevant. The value is what matters. The value of that click, right? Did what happened meet my expectation? And did it help me get where I'm going? So you want to introduce new information and enable action at the most relevant, most appropriate points of the experience. You don't ask somebody for a commitment, okay, until you've dated them more than a couple times, right? You don't ask for a kiss on a first date. Well, some people do, but same difference, all right? Every visible response to a user action has to match that person's prediction as to what they expected to happen. It has to add immediate value, and it has to add positively to the entire cumulative experience over time. You have to deliver proof that the person is moving closer and achieving their goal, okay? How are we doing on time, by the way? I have no idea. What time are we over? 12? What's that? Okay, I'm good. This is a big one. Technology changes all the time. Okay? Platforms change, languages change, the techniques that we use obviously change. People are essentially the same, and the way that we're wired has been relatively consistent over the past, couple hundred years. So we have questions. Whenever we see something, there's a set of first-use questions that are automatically there and that you have to be designing for. What is this? Is it what I expected to see? Does it look credible? Does it look trustworthy? Does it offer what I came here for? Am I going to be able to understand it? That's a big one. Okay? People need to feel like they're competent. Am I going to be able to get this? Is it going to be too hard? Does it look valuable enough for me to stick around? What actions can I take right now? And how do I learn more? And also, it's not included here, but what happens if I screw up? Okay, what if I make a mistake? What do I do? So this is a big takeaway, okay? Technology changes, people don't. It's very easy to sort of get seduced into the latest platform, latest trend, latest UI trend, which we've talked about. You got to remember that the way people judge things and the way that we react to things isn't very different, okay? So you got to focus on the questions that are related to first use. What people see on the screen has to answer those questions on some level, or at least suggest that the answers lie within. Communicating means a lot more than just meeting expectation, okay? But meeting expectation is probably the key principle that gets people to stick around, okay? Consistency between the parts, which means software as a whole, right? Or software on a device, and the whole, which is the operating system, helps create ease of use. The save and cancel pattern that you see in this dialog box is a convention. It's an expected way of interacting with something. So if you're designing an app, it's part of a larger whole. If you're working in an enterprise-type situation where a company has 3 or 4 systems and customers use all 3 or 4 of those systems, consistency to some degree across them is terribly important. Not in how they look, in how they behave, in how they present content, in how they step you through a process, in how the primary actions are called out. UI conventions, things that already exist, things that people are used to, can help you communicate, all right? Windows dialog boxes have this OK and cancel pattern in the lower right-hand corner, okay? They're always there. The OK button is always on the inside. Why is that? Well, because that's where users expect to find them. Why is that? Because that's where Microsoft consistently puts them. Okay? I don't have to think about that, ever. I know where it is. I automatically gravitate there before I even think about it. We would get a lot less done every day if it weren't for habit and reflex. Okay? When something breaks the habit, breaks the reflexive instinct, it's hard to use. It's all those little disconnects, those little interruptions, okay, that gets us stuck. Now, people say just because Microsoft does it, or just because Apple does it, just because Google does it, that doesn't make it right. Well, see, actually it does in a lot of cases, particularly if you're designing for one of those platforms. Those conventions have trained people to expect certain things, right? Everybody knows Windows Metro, right? When the Start menu went away, people lost their minds, all right? I know at least 10 developers, personally, who all, and I thought this was great, told me at different points that they had essentially hacked the OS in order to create a Start menu. All right? When those expectations are met consistently, people don't have to work very hard to figure out how to use something. That's communication. So I want to talk briefly, and I don't do anything briefly, who am I kidding, about communicating with visual elements, all right? Clear communication in the UI is a balancing act. It's a balance of legibility, readability, typography, symbolism, and multiple views of different things, okay? Almost all those things rely, to some degree, on color and texture and contrast. The key point I want to talk about is something called pattern recognition. Now, everybody knows what letter this is, right? Even though it's represented, you know, in 5 very different ways up here. The reason you know what that letter is because of pattern recognition. You've seen that combination, 2 slashes bisected by a line, hundreds of thousands of times. So even when the pattern becomes abstract, you can still recognize it. However, when you start doing that with bodies of text, with multiple words, sentences, paragraphs, changes a little bit. This is pretty easy to read. Sans serif font, high contrast, okay, I got it. Introduce a serif font, interferes with pattern recognition a little bit, okay? It takes a little more effort to read a serif font, but by and large, it's not destructive in any way. When you get totally decorative, different story. The pattern is broken, all right? The common denominator, the continuous, you know, sort of pattern that we recognize is broken. So even though there are 9,000 fonts that we all get to play with, right? Google released an entire font library now that we can embed, and there's just all this stuff available to us. The thing you have to be careful about with fonts is you don't want to interfere with pattern recognition. The more decorative something gets, the more work I have to do to understand it, okay? So you have to focus on how your design choices work, not how they look. Ask yourself these questions, okay? Is what we're putting on screen in line with what we said we were trying to accomplish strategically? What's the reason we're doing this? What's the reason people are using this? Does the UI help the user understand the options that are available? Does the UI help them understand how things are related to other things? Proximity, alignment, negative space. Does it provide clear guidance as to what actions can be taken, right? What can I do here, and how do I do that? Does it provide guidance as to what they're supposed to do next? I've taken one action, now what? Feedback. Okay? Does it hint at what might happen if I act? That type of prediction is a big thing as well, right? Do I get a sense of what's going to take place after I take this action? So the takeaway is this, okay? And I said it at the beginning, and I'm going to say it again because it's that important. when you think about design on the screen, when you think about the UI part, when you think about what people see, don't focus on what it looks like. Don't focus on whether it's attractive or unattractive, okay? Those things are important. We established that. What you need to focus on is what problems you are solving, okay? You are solving visual problems. It's about organizing, economizing, communicating. Attractiveness is nice, but it's a distant second to those three things. Okay, maybe even third or fourth, to be honest. If you focus on that, great user experience will take care of itself. And that is that. Any questions? Yes? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Like the parallax stuff where you're scrolling up and down? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. It infuriates me. and it's the same thing. Look, it's the same thing as flat design. What we're talking about, for those of you who didn't hear, is that you see these websites that have parallax scrolling where they're constantly introducing new elements, right, as you go down. And wayfinding like just disappears completely. It's the something new syndrome, okay? This was introduced, it was a new approach to something, and it certainly has value, okay? Because there is an element of progressive disclosure there where I keep seeing things. But again, you can't take away my guideposts. You can't take away my navigation, my wayfinding. You still, at any given point in my journey, I need a "you are here" sign. That has nothing to do with user interface design. It has nothing to do with user experience, whatever. It's a human need. I want to know where I am, and I want to know where I can go from here. The minute that goes away, I'm uncomfortable. So you're right. You do see a lot of it, and the reason is people are just aping the style. Well, it's trendy now. We got to do that parallax thing, right? I don't have enough, fingers and toes, or maybe even memory, to remember how many times I've heard, this has to be responsive. Okay, and I ask why. Well, why does it have to be responsive? So people can use it on their smartphones. So then I ask, are people going to use it on their smartphones? Remember, a lot of times we're talking about enterprise apps here. What are they really going to do on a screen this big? You know what the answer is I get to that? This. Because nobody knows. All right, that's the whole premise of what I'm talking about here. It's not what you do that matters. It's how you think about what you do, right? You have to think about whether that's appropriate. So what 25,000 other sites are using have responsive design? So what if they're all using parallax scrolling? So what if they use flat design? It does not automatically make it appropriate. If you ape the style without thinking about whether it matters to people or whether it's going to communicate, whether it's going to help them make sense of what they see, you're not solving problems, you're just decorating. So I think you're right, it does break all those principles. Context. You heard me say context a million times in this presentation. Context is everything. In some cases, it's the only thing. Anybody else? Questions? Thoughts? Yes, sir. Sure. Sure. So you're talking about, there's a balancing act between, don't make me think, don't make me work too hard. What's that? Oh, sorry. Yeah. So he's saying, where do I stand on, don't make me think, don't make me work too much as a user, versus what I said about every click delivering value, that people will click 100 times if they perceive value, right? Did I get your question? Correct? Right. The element of user investment, how much is too much, right? If we ask them to click 100 times, is that asking too much of the person? It's a balancing act. It's absolutely a balancing act. Nothing should be harder than it needs to be. Okay, in e-commerce, you mentioned e-commerce. In e-commerce, checkout patterns and workflow sequences with enterprise apps, okay, there are lots of workflow sequences. One of the first questions, I mean, we start everything with boxes and arrows, right? How many steps are there here? How many things are we asking them to do? You look at volume. And then you say, can any of this be consolidated? Does it really have to? These have to be two discrete actions, right? Or in the case of content, do you really need an email address and a username, or can the email address be the username and that's it? Okay? So the economizing part of what I talked about is definitely important. However, there are definitely times when it makes sense to separate actions because contextually they're very different, right? On a series of screens, when you're asking somebody to do something, I'm trying to think about, let's see, in an e-commerce process, if you're mixing, you know, sort of a confirmation of product, right? Here's what you have in your cart, here's the quantity, here's what it costs. If you mix that with here's your billing information, people get stumped because the two things contextually are unrelated in a sense, right? It's a discrete act, your head is in a different place. Now I'm thinking about this aspect of what I'm doing. So the workflow has to match the context of the user's action and what they happen to be focused on at that point. That's how I determine separation. If that happens to be 8 screens instead of 3, as long as we're not introducing extraneous stuff that could be combined, then I'm okay with that. Because, again, I'm fortunate in that I've been doing this long enough to sort of see repeated instances of the same things, right? So experience tells me that that number doesn't matter as long as things are clearly separated contextually and as long as they get the sense that they're moving along the path the way they expect. But don't misunderstand me. There is absolutely an element of don't make the person work too hard. And we talked about cognitive load, right? It's very important. And it's difficult sometimes, to be honest. All right? The more complex the app, the harder it is to make those decisions. It's tough, which is why we prototype. Yes, sir. Yep. Yep. Sure.
It basically uses some of my kind of UX work. It has to be like this because everybody knows how this works on a website, and I just tweak whatever needs tweaking, and the rest is basically standard.
Okay.
It's not a good thing that we actually reach this point where you don't have each website have doing its own thing. I don't have to learn how to use your website. I know how your website works because it's like every other website I've seen.
Right, there's consistency. Right, the parts, individual websites, and the whole, which is the internet. Okay, so is parallax in and of itself necessarily bad? You're saying there's commonality, right? Now that we're seeing more flat design, more parallax, people know what that does. To a degree, that is true, okay? And it's an easy sort of jump to make. There are certainly a large group of users in very specific sects, particularly in consumer market, who are intimately familiar with that. And they're also younger, right? And they totally get it, and it's a non-issue, right? Because they're used to it. However, even in that market, okay, I mean, I've had 2 clients that I can think of right now where we did a lot of prototype testing, and people didn't know how to get back to the navigation in both cases. All right, so on one hand, you say to yourself, this is so common, that it should be sort of accepted, right? People get it, and it's nice that there's some consistency. I agree with the positive points of what you're saying, right? Consistency in approach is important. At the same time, human beings are not that simple, okay? If we line up all of us in this room, we do not all perceive things the same way. So even if we've seen the pattern 100 times, if it runs counter to what our expectation is based on everything else that we use, it's still a problem. So it depends on who the audience is my point. It's not necessarily bad. None of it is necessarily bad. I think, in fact, the parallax stuff, I think, has not been leveraged to its full potential. All right? Its potential for progressive disclosure in a very flowing story-like manner, I think is huge, right? It's tremendous. But it's just being slapped on all kinds of things where the audience goes, okay, that's not, I don't even know what to do with this. You know, I have a client right now who I just saw, I got to look at their navigation last week. It's in the center of the page. There's a bunch of stuff on top. It's in the center. They're using a template that has the parallax effect built in. Well, that's the template. When you start scrolling, the nav moves to the top. Okay? We sat in a room with 60 people. And the first question was, okay, how would you go to this page? 12 minutes passed before anybody clicked on something. 12 minutes. And it wasn't that obtuse, okay? It was just basically a huge image and some other stuff. And again, it has everything to do with what we expect. These people are all conditioned that the navigation is up there. And even though it's right in front of them, it's staring them in the face, right? You're behind the glass and you're going, how do you not see that? It'll shock you. It really will. So I agree with you and disagree, I guess, at the same time. It's a great question, though. Anybody else? Their ability to play with the design? You mean like the exploration part of it?
So say if you have like many moves slightly when you grow them,
Mm-hmm.
play with it. Do you feel that is making them focus too much on the UI? Or do you feel that helps them to engage with the product?
Okay, so the question is, you know, when there's activity in the UI, when there's movement or animation or sort of fun things, right? Does it enhance their experience or does it detract from it? Did I get your question right? Right, that the focus should be on the task at hand. Again, it's about thinking about what those things are and how you apply them, because here's the deal. Interactivity, movement, motion, sort of fun stuff that happens with the UI, if it's in response to something I do and if it gives me a clue as to what that thing's purpose is, even if it's nothing more than I do something, okay? One of the biggest losses on smartphones when they first came out, right, is that there's no hover state. Hover states are a huge interaction clue, okay? I do something. I'm a button. You can click me, right? That little change in color or whatever it is, those are cues, and those visual cues are important. So animation and sort of interesting looking things absolutely can serve a purpose, as long as they serve a purpose. If they're moving just to move, right, that's decoration, and people will get tired of it very quickly. If the reason it moves is because it's sending you a signal that I do something and here's how I do it, for example, that's very valuable. It's important. Okay, we depend on those things, specifically in an age where everything is very complex. You know, we're dealing with more information now than we have at any other point in history, on every screen. So yeah, it can definitely be appropriate. Anybody else? No more burning questions? All right. Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it. All right, so my point is this. Your ability between your ears to do what you do is what allows you to be great. It's how you think about what you do as opposed to what you do tactically. Okay? That's the premise. Finally, I want to tell you this. Implementing the right solutions poorly, okay, which means you have great UX but poor UI design, is infinitely better then implementing the wrong solutions well, which means, hey, the UI looks great, right? It's beautiful. Everybody loves it. Wow, that's so cool. It looks fantastic. You know, and people will tell you, oh, I'd love to use that. If the UX is bad, the product fails, no matter how good it looks. You can get by with poor UI design if the user experience is spectacular, if it's easy to use, if it's easy to predict the outcomes of your action, if it follows some of the things we're going to talk about today. Okay? Keep that in mind. How many of you start your design process when you have to deal with a UI? I'm assuming some of you are tasked with designing UIs, right? How many of you start by looking at themes, Bootstrap, things like that? Nobody. A couple guys. Okay. That's a good thing, actually, because first place to look is not themes. Themes look very nice. Google right now, you know, UI themes or UI patterns or anything, and you'll see any number of very nice-looking things. The problem is those collections don't tell you anything about what problems they were created to solve. Okay? You have no idea how the design decisions were made to implement those examples. You're essentially just looking at something that's visual, but you don't have any sense of whether it's appropriate. Okay? Context is everything when it comes to interaction. For those of you who do design, how many of you start by looking at the work of other designers, other UIs? You can raise your hands big, it's okay. All right? Don't do that either. Okay? Don't look for inspiration. For pretty much the same reason. You will not find inspiration looking at the work of other designers, other UI designers. And the reason for that, and I want you to think about it for a second, the reason for that is that you won't find inspiration. What you will find is you'll find someone else's solution to someone else's problem. All right? They're solving a very different problem than you are. The problem that you have to solve belongs to you. It belongs to your clients. It belongs to the context in which people use what you're building. Context. So this is one of my favorite quotes when it comes to design of any kind, okay? Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the wise. Seek what they sought. All right? You're after the same thing in that you want to make it easy for people to use, right, what you're building. You want it to succeed. If it's your own app or your own system, you want it to make money. Or you just want people to share it and download it and love it, whatever it is. But the intent, okay, and the perceived outcome is infinitely more important. Anybody keep abreast of what's going, current UI trends? Anybody feeling the need to migrate to flat design? A couple people, okay? Don't do that either. Flat design is very much a widespread trend right now, okay? It's everywhere. Not to mention that the term drives me crazy, okay, because this is not new. However, what I'm seeing a lot of is that designers are adopting the look without considering whether it's appropriate or not. Okay? One of the unfortunate things about the term user experience is the fact that the word user is in the title. User experience is about more than that. It's, to my way of thinking, it's a value loop, okay? On one side of the equation, you have users who want things that make their lives easier, right? They want to feel confident, they want to feel competent, they want to feel in control. On the other side of the equation, you have the business, right? Somebody's paying for all this. They have goals, all right? They have things that they're trying to accomplish. And at the end of the day, for most businesses, that means one of two things. It either means making money or saving it. Where user experience excels, where good design excels, where sound development practices and powerful technology excels, is in the middle, okay, where things serve both of those needs, both of those masters. To me, if you're not addressing either side of this equation, if you're missing the boat on one side, you're going to wind up with a problem. Here's what I know to be true. You absolutely do not have to be a visual artist in order to create useful, valuable, powerful user experiences, okay? It's not necessary. You do, however, have to be a problem solver of the absolute highest order. That's what design is. It's problem solving. It's not decoration, it's not aesthetics. It's problem solving. That means that in essence, you do have to be a designer, which in my mind, how many developers do we have here? All of you. All right? In my opinion, you are closer to designers than you may think. Okay? Developers excel at solving complex problems, at making the complex simple. Designers do the same thing, the good ones. Well, my name is Joe Natoli. I am here to talk to you essentially about user experience. But we are also going to cross over a little bit into user interface design. All right? The topic here is called Think First. Why great UX starts between your ears and not on the screen. Okay? The idea being that when everybody, not everybody, but when most people think about user experience, their first thoughts are, it's about what happens on the screen, okay? Which is true. That's where it manifests itself. That's the part that people interact with. But for those of us here, those of you here who are developers, that is often seen as a challenge, right? I'm not a designer. I'm not a UI guy. That's not my strength. What I'm essentially here to tell you is that it doesn't matter, okay? You can create great user experiences. You can create very solid user interfaces without a shred of visual talent. And that's what we're going to talk about. A little bit about me to get this out of the way, so you aren't asking yourself, who the heck is this guy and why do I care what he has to say? I've spent the last 26 years helping organizations improve user and customer experience. Most of those organizations are Fortune 100, Fortune 500, and government organizations. I've also done, a lot of work with startups as well. The majority of that work is enterprise applications, okay? Most of my stuff is definitely B2B, financial services, healthcare, but I've certainly, done time in the consumer realm as well. I had my own firm for about 10 years. I sold it in 2007 to an IT firm. Hung out there for a couple of years to help them establish a UX practice, and got really restless. So I went back to doing what I love most, which is consulting. The things that I know, the things I'm going to share with you, okay, come from experience. And I want you to understand that experience doesn't necessarily equal success. Okay? Experience with failure is probably the greatest teacher you will ever have. It's the greatest teacher I've ever had. I've been part of projects that have succeeded, and I've been part of projects that have failed spectacularly. And I've learned some very important, albeit very hard, lessons from those things, okay? My entire philosophy is, if you've heard the expression, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. That's my philosophy behind what I do. I think that everybody in a team, an organization, is responsible for great user experience, okay? It's everybody's business. So therefore, everyone needs to understand some piece of how to do this and how it applies to what they do all day, okay? I have a book coming up, which I'm not going to bore you with the details, but, shameless self-promotion here. I got the audience. I have to tell you about it, right? It's called Think First, and it's based on this premise, essentially, okay? Again, I'm not going to bore you with all this, but we talk about user research, what questions you ask stakeholders, to the 3 critical questions you have to ask every client, every time, a better way to get meaningful UX requirements, which is the full-day workshop that I'm doing on Friday, okay? How to avoid scope creep, how to eliminate last-minute requests and surprises, okay, from clients, colleagues. So I have a special discount for all DevWeek attendees. If you see me after the session and give me a business card, you'll get it for a very significant discount, 30%, okay? That's that. The premise is this.